It's a pleasure to be here. I was just thinking about Michael's welcome to country and thought that's an incredible message stick. I wish my messages were as clear and as well articulated as Michael's done. But I might get some lessons later perhaps. So I'm going to talk about consumer involvement in clinical trials, and it's a fantastic opportunity to be here in an audience like this where the focus is really about clinical trials, something that I'm not actually sure has happened very much in the southern cities of this eastern seaboard, but it is a pleasure to be here in Sydney, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm really going to talk about, when we talk about clinical trials, I think that narrows our thinking a little bit. And what I want to try and give you a sense of is that clinical trials are a critical, essential part of healthcare. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to show you their role in that regard in a moment. And the role of consumers in actually improving the health system is about involving consumers in clinical trials as well. So if we're going to have a health system that we think we're proud of, that's delivering, that's doing all the things we want it to do, we think of this as a self-improving health system. Any system we work in, if it's a business, anything you work in, you'd like to think that it learns from it what it does and it continues to improve. And if you're going to talk about a self-improving, high-quality health system, then I've put down here some at least. You could probably have a long list of very important principles, but these are what I call the fundamental principles. High-quality healthcare is critical to all stakeholders. Doesn't matter who you are, we all want high-quality healthcare. And I've never yet spoken to an audience where someone says, actually, we want suboptimal healthcare. We want poor quality healthcare. Nobody does. High-quality healthcare saves money. That sort of sounds obvious in a way, doesn't it? And yet when you talk to Treasury, you don't always get that opinion. Somehow the words high quality mean special, mean a whole lot of resources being thrown at a problem, as opposed to just doing healthcare well. I'm an oncologist. Not operating on someone that shouldn't be operated on is high quality healthcare. They shouldn't have an operation, and they shouldn't have an operation. And to do so is poor quality. Not special, just understanding what the evidence is and saying high quality healthcare is obviously going to save money. And a message that I don't think we've necessarily sold. And high quality healthcare has got to be based on evidence. It's not what I did yesterday. It's not what happened to my last patient. It's based on evidence so that we learn from what we've done. We're not sure what to do. We do a randomized trial. It's the only way to prove an hypothesis. And then we develop an evidence base. And from that evidence base, we move forward and implement those findings. And really so that the best evidence, I'm not saying the only evidence, but the best evidence comes from randomized clinical trials. So within ACTA, we've developed this model of a self-improving health system. And the words are probably not easy to read from too far past the front row, but essentially we've got three circles on this figure. And I'm going to talk a little bit about them as we go. We've got research and clinical trials. Let's see if this works. You can see the mouse. So we've got research and clinical trials, testing an idea. Is this the best way to treat this condition? Is this the best way to look after a preterm bub? Testing the question about how we move forward. But when you've got the answer, you need to implement that. You need to practice that. And then as you practice it and people start to say, yep, I get the evidence, that's what I do, you measure what happens in the real world. And registries is one way of doing that. It's not the only way, but it is an effective way of doing so. And when you do things in the real world, you see change, you see variation. And I want to show you what that means. So you start to measure what's happening in the real world. And every time we've looked at this in the space of registries, we just measure quality of care, there is variation. And in healthcare, it wouldn't surprise you, there's always variation. There are patient factors, there are geographic factors, there are socioeconomic factors. There's always going to be variation. But the question really comes to why is there variation? And particularly when there's variation that's unwarranted. Why is it occurring? And you could put down again a whole list of potential explanations. Perhaps there's difficulty in accessing services. Perhaps clinicians have got personal preferences, or indeed patients. Perhaps the evidence doesn't exist, or clinicians don't know about it, or it's not accepted, or there are other incentives that may lead to variation, unwarranted variation. And the obvious things that lead themselves to the question of trials is the evidence isn't accepted. And quite commonly, that'll be a clinician saying, excuse me, a clinician saying, that evidence doesn't apply to my patient. My patients are different, or the circumstances are different, or the evidence is weak. It was only a small trial, it was only done in a small number of patients. That doesn't change my practice. Or clinicians don't know about it. And it is impossible these days to keep up with any one field, I would argue, let alone more than one field. Or the evidence doesn't exist. And you might say, well, how can it be in 2019 that the evidence doesn't exist? We've had thousands of trials for so many years, some by sponsors, by industry, by device companies, by clinicians. So here are the current treatment guidelines for colorectal cancer in Australia. These are on the wiki page, wiki platform, and they've been developed by a process of reviewing the evidence, systematic review, and so forth. And what you can see here is the grades of recommendation and the levels of evidence. Grade recommendation is 1. There's very strong evidence that you should be doing this. So in the management of colorectal cancer, one of the commonest cancers in our community, 1 level A recommendation. Level B, body of evidence can be trusted to guide practice. You can trust it to guide what you should do. 1 recommendation. These are the current guidelines. These aren't 2005, 1995, this is 2018-19. Level D, greater recommendation, level D, body of evidence is weak and recommendation must be applied with caution. 17. Consensus. A whole lot of guys get together, men and women, and we just agree. Let's agree on this. Is that how you want to be treated? Is that how I want to be treated? That's sometimes all we've got. But is it good enough? So there is going to be uncertainty about the evidence base, which allows us to say, how do we do that better? So we go to trials, and we do randomized trials, and we test an hypothesis. And you might say, well, since, John, you're talking about evidence, what's the evidence that randomized trials make a difference, actually? You know, this is just people, academics, playing in a test tube of humankind. Is it appropriate to say that it improves healthcare? There's very good evidence that if you're in a trial, if you're actually enrolled in a clinical trial, you've got a better outcome. But that's not necessarily due to the intervention. It might be just because the trial protocol selects out the very best people, very best in the sense that they're the fittest. They don't have comorbid conditions. They're younger, perhaps, than the population that normally has that problem. And of course, if you receive an experimental intervention, which happens to be a new treatment which is very effective, then you wouldn't be surprised that you have a better outcome. So people in trials have better outcomes. And one explanation is the protocol itself. So it doesn't matter whether you receive the experimental treatment, which is this brand new whiz-bang drug, or whether or not you're in the control arm. Because the protocol itself, even if you're the right age and you haven't been selected, the protocol says to the clinician, this is when the tests are done. This is what tests are done. This is how often they are looked at. This is what you do when the test result is normal. This is what you do when the test result is abnormal. So if you're in the control arm of a clinical trial, you still have a better outcome. And again, the evidence is reasonable that that's the case. But what about more broadly? So in general, there's only about 5, 10, depends on the discipline, 10% of patients with a particular condition that are actually enrolled in clinical trials. And we could talk about that also separately, but that's about the average. So what happens to the rest? You're not in the trial. What's the impact of trial on on that system? And then the question is, and this is an example of where Sydney Health District is going to be able to say our outcomes are going to be better. When the day comes that we measure and compare our outcomes, they're going to be better because we're involved in clinical trials, and this is why. So this is a correlation between research activity. This is not a randomized trial, unfortunately. It's hard to do this as a randomized trial, but it's a correlation between research activity across UK trusts and the association with outcomes, in this case mortality. Pretty important outcome. And what you can see in this graph is on the vertical axis is mortality, and then on the horizontal axis, research funding, amount of funding per bed. And what you can see is that if there's more funding for research obtained by those trusts, mortality is lower. This is mortality at 30 days. Now, you might say, well, yes, of course it would be. They've got more doctors, they've got more nurses, they've got more machines that go ping in the night. They might have, but the data that was led to these results were, at least they attempted to control for that. And this is what they found. Okay, so let's have a look, is there any other evidence? So this is a study done in the US. There's 174,000 people in this group of hospitals with angina. 174,000. And of those 174,000, 3% were involved in trials. So 4,500, 3%. So most people were not in trials. But what they did is, within those 3%, they looked at the centres that recruited a lot of patients and those that recruited a small number. And this is what they found. This is compliance with guidelines. So the American Heart Association has a set of guidelines of management of angina, and this is compliance with guidelines. And if you were a hospital that had a high recruitment, even though it's a minority of your patients, your compliance with guidelines was much higher, as you can see in this high enrolment group. And short-term mortality, this is 30-day mortality, not of the people in the trial. This is the mortality of 174,000 people with cardiac disease. Mortality is lower in the centres that are research active. How do we facilitate? So trials, I would argue, improve healthcare for the whole community, not just the community of patients enrolled in those trials. So how do we facilitate implementation of trials? So you say, well, okay, you've done all these trials, and it's what's been said to me, particularly by government, is, John, it's all very well to do these trials, but no one implements the results. They just go into the literature, they're published, your CV looks better, but it doesn't change practice. And it's generally said that it takes about 17 years from the time results are actually produced and published to when practice changes. So how are we going to facilitate that? That's too long. It's much too long, and it's an average, and it depends, obviously, on the area and the discipline. And I would put to you that the way we facilitate the implementation of the results of trials is to do more trials. And I want to show you a simplistic example of what that means. So the top panel is a trial that's done in the United States. I mean, any trial you like, and the dates are just, indicative, just to give you a sense. They often take much longer than this. But in 2019, a group of clinicians and hopefully consumers will sit down in a room in the US, they're in Boston, and they think about the trial they want to do. An important question. And they think about the trial, and when they think about the trial, they've got to say, well, what's the question here? We're doing a trial, we're randomizing people to a new treatment. What's the standard treatment? What's the treatment we're going to compare it to? Do we all agree what the standard is? And guess what? They don't always agree, right? Because everyone's got their own view. Those consensus recommendations, they don't all agree. But they work it out. They work out what we're going to compare this new intervention. It can be a surgical procedure, it can be a relaxation therapy, it can be anything you like. They work out what they're going to compare it to. Then they do the trial in 2020. They analyse it 2 years later, a very fast trial. They publish an abstract in 2024. They publish it in the New England Journal in 2025. And everyone's happy. In 2028, it gets into the guidelines. So now there are guidelines as to how the impact of this new treatment and then practice changes. And in blue is meant to be an indication, when does practice change in Australia? That trial was designed and run in Boston and throughout the US. When does practice change here? And I'd put it to you that at least arguably it starts to change when we see the abstract maybe, but it's an abstract, there's not enough data. Let's wait for the publication. We wait for the publication. There's another study being done by someone else. We'll wait a bit longer. Comes out, the guidelines come out, practice starts to change. Now we're in Sydney. We're sitting in Lifehouse and we're designing the same trial. And I put to you, when does practice change in Australia? When does the oncologist, and I'm an oncologist, so I'm sorry for the focus, but when does practice change for oncologists in Sydney? And I'd put it to you that when they walk out of that room, when they figured out what the standard of care was, when they reviewed the evidence to know what standard treatment was against which they were going to compare the new treatment, when they figured out what was standard, they changed care forevermore, because they walked out of the room, went to the clinic, saw a patient with that illness and said, I know how to treat you because we've just reviewed the evidence. And the evidence says that today, this is what you need to do. And yes, we're doing a trial, and in 5 years, we'll have a result of that, but this is what we think is best practice today. When does practice change in Australia? It changes when you design the trial. Trials improve the health system. They're much more than just about trials. So, if nothing else, you'll see that I'm passionate about this. Clinical trials are critical to a high-quality health system. And we must embed clinicians in this. We must expect that clinicians question the standards, the quality of care. They must test the existing evidence base. And as young clinicians, we grow up and we have an apprentice system for medicine. And we're taught how to do things. And that's how we continue to do them. We've got to keep testing. Is that evidence-based? And often you'll find, as those colorectal recommendations indicated, they're often not very strongly evidence-based. But then, of course, we've got to if we're embedded in the question, if we involve clinicians and they actually say, yeah, I get the question, the evidence for that isn't very strong. Let's do a trial to answer that question. When they get embedded in the question, they get embedded in the answer. Okay. So research in healthcare is basically a very simple thing. How do we do healthcare better? But this talk was about consumers. And I think the first thing is that as a community, the community needs to understand, and I hope does understand increasingly, that we are doing trials not about doing trials for trials' sake. We are doing trials to improve healthcare. But the reason why consumers need to be involved is they are the centre of this. Those three circles on the diagram, in the centre of that is the patient or the person with a health condition that we need to help, that we can help. And when we talk about consumers, of course, you immediately get into, well, who is a consumer? And of course, we all are. Patients and potential patients, carers, and people who use healthcare services. Like the person who was perfect in Michael's welcome, I don't think there's anyone who's ever going to be able to say they're not in some way going to be a consumer. But we do think about involvement. So involvement is defined as an active partnership. It involves consumers and the community in clinical research, not simply as research participants. Whereas engagement, just to make sure we're talking about the same language, engagement is about sharing information and knowledge about trials with consumers and the community. So I said to you, the reason I think we should be involving consumers at the very outset in the very thinking about what the question is that if we're doing research to improve healthcare, how can we not ask the recipients of that healthcare what it is that's important to them? How can you do that? It doesn't make any sense. And Tom Wally, some of you may know Tom. Tom was one of the leading figures in the NIHR in the UK, and he's now in Newcastle. And he put it this way: the desire to ensure that patients' views are central to the design and delivery of research, and to ensure that research meets the needs of patients. And is quoted as saying, if a scientist puts an application into one of my programs and he or she doesn't have a patient as a co-applicant, it's going in the bin. And for researchers in the audience, that is what it's going to be like here in very soon, if it isn't already. This is a sort of very prominent paper in The Lancet a couple of years ago, and was talking about waste in research. They were talking about $240 billion industry, of which they said 85% was wasted. And the reasons were things like this: research decisions not based on questions relevant to users of research. The users are us, the community. We are the users of research. And if the question's not relevant to us, then we shouldn't be doing the research in the first place. And then there's a whole range of reasons. But low priority questions are questions that don't take into account the potential users of that research. And as I say, this I think has strongly influenced funding bodies, a range of organisations, about the importance of making sure that the consumer is not just being talked to, but actually front and centre. And the journals are getting this. The journals now are changing their policies and requiring consumer involvement in studies, and for authors to indicate how those consumers were included in the design, conduct and reporting of trials. And the NHMRC and Medical Research Future Fund are also requiring applicants to outline consumer and community involvement. This pendulum is changing, and it's going to continue to change. But in fact, having sat on a recent research panel for NHMRC, the studies, the trials that don't involve consumers, it's so obvious. It's so obvious about the fact that how the research will be used, what will happen to that research. It's clearly not been thought of, and it impacts significantly on the design of those studies. There's some good reasons to involve consumers, just if you think about nothing else except getting the work done. So this is a study of mental health trials, and trials with the highest level of involvement were over 4 times more likely to recruit to target. And I'll show you a fabulous example of that in a minute. This is a study done by a contract research organisation called ParExcel, and this is mainly related to industry trials. Patient-centric designs had faster study enrolment times and were 19% more likely to be launched. So I was introduced as the chair of ACTA, and we were very interested in this whole question of what's the role of consumers and how are consumers involved in trials. And so we did a survey. To start with, we developed a reference group of people interested in the area, and the reference group was about strengthening consumer engagement. And there were a large number of members of this reference group from obviously consumers and consumer advocates, but also clinicians and NHMRC and so forth. And the aim was to strengthen capacity and ability to involve consumers in research. And we obviously did an environmental scan, so we looked at the literature and saw what was out there, and then said, well, how can we contribute to this space? And we did a survey of the research sector, of the clinical trials networks. And 34 of the about 40 networks around Australia responded to this survey, and about 19 of them involving consumers in some way or other, some very extensively. But a third are still grappling with how to do this. And you can see in this figure that so there's the 19, some are planning to, some with no plans, and some we weren't sure. But where they did involve consumers, and this was particularly the cancer groups who have got often older networks, and older in the sense that they've been going a longer time, and so they had consumers involved at board level, advisory panel, vision development, setting research priorities. I won't go through all of this in the interest of time, but certainly across a wide range of areas. When consumers are involved in networks, they really are quite involved. And you won't be able to read this slide very well, but at the trial level, we looked at the involvement of consumers. And these are the groups that did involve consumers. And you can see that one on the left is gap analysis, so involved in understanding where the needs are, all the way through to working with the network on reimbursement, which is the other end of this histogram. In terms of barriers and enablers to consumers, so less than a third actually provided any training. And none of us got into clinical trials without training. And so we've learned how to do that, and we can't assume that the community is going to be able to join without having the similar opportunities for training. There's lack of funding at an organisation and a trial level, and a lack of know-how of actually how to engage consumers in the first place, and how to make that meaningful. And I think still, more so in Australia than I think in say, the US, still a limited awareness of the importance of clinical trials. If you saw a headline tomorrow on guinea pigs in research, or human guinea pigs, you wouldn't be surprised, would you? And yet, that's not what we're thinking about, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about improving healthcare, and how do we do that? We asked consumers about why they were involved, and as you can see, the opportunity to help others, I think a common theme around Australia for lots of things, and that was probably the most important driving force, and then the second one was personal experience in themselves or family. Involvement of consumers often came from direct invitations or a response to an expression of interest. But less than 20% of those people involved had actually participated in a clinical trial. But there was a number of enablers, and I give this lecture and then I go back to my registry and we have a meeting and there's no consumer there, they live in the country. You know, this isn't something that you just say and it happens, and as I think Warwick said, it's something that we've got to say, if it's important, we make it work. If we had to have a statistician, there'd be a statistician there. If we want a consumer there, there's got to be a consumer there. And the sort of comments made by consumers, you'll be, not surprising, bringing a human face to a clinical process, expressing information in the right language, lots of reasons. This year, for the first year, ACTA had a Consumer Trial of the Year award. And this was a trial that demonstrated the power of consumers. So this was a trial in babies born prematurely. And the question that was being asked is, should they receive 30% oxygen or 60% oxygen? And the model that was being used is the mother delivers a baby preterm, the baby needs oxygen, oh my God, we need consent. Imagine going up to that woman and saying, we need you, I know you're not feeling great and you've just had this delivery, but actually we want you to see whether you consent to this trial. Needless to say, recruitment was poor because it required informed consent. So they went to the consumers and they said, we don't know which treatment we should give to these babies. Can you help us? And the consumer went to the ethics committee and said, guys, we don't want this model of research ethics that you think is the only way to do research. We want the randomization to be done before the baby's born or before at the time, automatically, and there's no consent for the mother at the time. And let's find out the answer. Because some units gave 30 and some gave 60 and none of us knew what was better. We want an answer to the question because the community wants the answer. That won Trial of the Year. What's next for ACTA? We're developing a good practice. Is that number, I'm well over time, right? Okay, I'm nearly finished, sorry. Good practice guidance, so support the research sector to undertake meaningful consumer involvement and increasing awareness in the community. And so we've actually, in the process of developing, I'll miss this slide and just show you this railway map. It looks like the Japan subway system, but actually it's a toolkit. And it's a toolkit in which you can go into any one part of it if you're a researcher, and ultimately if you're a consumer, and you'll be able to say, I need help with this. I need help with recruitment. I need help with reporting back to consumers. What do we tell consumers involved in trials? This toolkit will help that, and as far as we know, it doesn't exist around the world. There are some other things happening in the consumer space, and they include the Consumer Health Forum has a white paper of which one of the 8 objectives is that there's a key role for consumers as research collaborators. And the clinical trial governance framework, again, at an institutional level, is going to mandate for purposes of accreditation involvement of consumers in research. But I do want to finish up with what I'm calling a call to action. And that is, sometimes this still feels passive to me. So we have a Medical Research Future Fund. It will have, if it doesn't already, have $20 billion invested. And it will pay out roughly, let's just round figures, $1 billion a year. Not just for 1 year, but next year, the year after, $1 billion a year. Where's the community view on what that should be spent on? I'm the Minister for Health. Tell me what you want to spend it on. I just saw this advocacy group and that advocacy group, and they all want me to spend money on their thing. But what's the community feel outside of my specific focus? How should we spend that money? What is important? If we were building a new stadium, do you reckon there'd be some media? Is there any media about what the community thinks about this, about how it's being spent? I'd like to finish up by acknowledging the various people I work with, the board of ACTA and the staff, members of the ACTA Consumer Reference Group, and Nicholas Strayton, who helped me put this talk together. Thank you for your attention.